John Dewey is perhaps one of the most important figures in American education. Throughout his life, Dewey was a philosopher, a writer, a psychologist, a teacher, and a leader in educational reform. Dewey valued both science and nature and was an avid reader as well as an author in his own right. He wrote many books during his lifetime and had many published articles as well. Dewey was a flexible thinker who adapted his views on the world as time passed. Though Dewey was an accomplished and innovative man with ideas that shaped the way we view education today, he was also a man with humble beginnings. John Dewey was born on October the 20th in 1859 in Burlington, Vermont. Dewey was one of 4 sons born to Archibald Spragg Dewey and Lucina Artemisia Rich Dewey, who were both from modest means. Dewey's mother was strict and very religious, while his father was more easygoing and laid back. It is due to this, perhaps, that Dewey developed a close relationship with his father. Dewey discovered his love for nature at an early age and spent much of his time as a child outdoors. Dewey didn't begin his formal education until after the Civil War. However, he had caught up to his grade level and completed public education by the time he was 12 years old, despite the fact that the schools he attended were initially in very poor condition. Dewey completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Vermont and then went on to teach high school for a few years before pursuing a graduate degree at Johns Hopkins University in 1882. After graduating in 1884, Dewey became a professor at the University of Michigan. It was here that Dewey first began to develop an interest in educational theory. Dewey went on to work at the University of Minnesota, the University of Chicago, and eventually Columbia University. Dewey had already shown a great interest in philosophy during his time at the University of Vermont and was heavily influenced by his professors, perhaps just as much as he was influenced by the philosophers whose work he studied. Though Dewey began his education with no specific goal in mind, it was his professors, Matthew Buckham and H.A.P. Torrey, that sparked Dewey's interest in philosophy. Though Dewey didn't see eye to eye with his professors on everything, it piqued his interest in philosophy to the point that he went on to major in philosophy for his graduate degree at Johns Hopkins. At Johns Hopkins, Dewey found more inspiration from his professors and was heavily influenced by his psychology professor, G. Stanley Hall, and his philosophy professor, George Sylvester Morris. Hall and Morris shaped many of Dewey's early views, with Dewey gaining a neo-Hegelian view from Morris and a fascination with the work of Darwin from Hall. Dewey was also influenced by F. Matthias Alexander, a physical culture teacher who is credited with creating the Alexander technique of self-help, which Dewey found very helpful when dealing with uncomfortable issues of a psychological nature. Dewey was introduced to neo-Hegelian views by his teacher at Johns Hopkins, George Sylvester Morris. Dewey was interested also in Kant's views on aesthetics, though his own views differed. He agreed with Kant's assertion that imagination was the creative power of the mind. James was heavily influential to Dewey and was a direct inspiration for Dewey's book, Art as Experience. James was also a fellow pragmatist with many views that were in line with Dewey's. Charles Darwin was hugely influential to Dewey, shaping much of Dewey's scientific views. Though Darwin's work was seen as largely controversial at the time, Dewey was a supporter of Darwin's ideas due to the fact that his professor, G. Stanley Hall, had been so interested in Darwin's work. Much of Darwin's work coincided with Dewey's philosophy on experience, which was very scientific in nature and focused on how organisms interact with their environment. Though Dewey was influenced by many great writers, thinkers, and educators in his time, it cannot be denied that the time Dewey lived in was tumultuous and was almost certainly an influence on Dewey and his views, especially his ideas about educational reform. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and immigrants from around the globe flocked to the United States. Many immigrants struggled in the public school systems as they barely spoke English. Dewey believed that the schools should teach practical skills that would be both useful in the home and in the workplace, and thought that the curriculum should be flexible enough to allow students the ability to study things that interested them. Dewey's pragmatic views helped to shape his views on education, which had an emphasis on problem solving and the scientific method. Dewey, in fact, developed his own five-step method to tackle and overcome problems, which he viewed as opportunities to test our abilities and develop our intelligence. This coincides with Dewey's view that the goal of education should be growth. Dewey advocated active learning and often sought to engage students through group activities and hands-on learning rather than the traditional approach of having students simply listen to lectures. Dewey also believed in making lessons interdisciplinary when possible and oftentimes included lessons that had practical skills as well as traditional subjects. During his time teaching at the University of Chicago, Dewey founded the University of Chicago Lab School, which he used to put many of his educational philosophies to the test. Dewey also put great emphasis on social interaction being vital in the classroom. These ideas were all radically different from the way that the school had been taught up to this point. Dewey's ideas about education eventually led to the progressive movement, which has influenced our public school system so profoundly that our schools would not be the same today without it. Dewey also had many ideas about the arts and studied aesthetics, and as such was very influential to the field of art education. Dewey viewed the arts as being mankind's greatest achievement and thought that the arts were essential for man to truly experience life. Dewey believed that the arts should be integrated into the lessons in his school, but only the ones that were practical for an occupation. Dewey viewed artists as intellectuals on the same level as scientists or philosophers, and saw artists as people who were particularly observant of the natural world. John Dewey died 15 years after retiring on June 1, 1962. He was not only a writer, philosopher, and important figure in educational reform, but also an important figure in American history. His influence and many contributions to the fields of psychology, philosophy, and education have had a vital and lasting effect. Dewey once said, "If we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, we rob them of tomorrow." And Dewey's legacy of educational reform is as enduring as his hopes for education.